The year is 1923, and the town records of Griesbach, a valley settlement pressed between the high shoulders of the Austrian Alps, bear an entry that should not exist. Among the neat columns of births, marriages, and deaths, the parish clerk has added another line, almost a casual tally, as if one were keeping track of sheep or the flow of grain. Transferred 214. The word stands by itself, devoid of names, devoid of destinations. No destination hospitals are cited. No families recorded as witnesses to these removals. For 14 years, patients passed through the iron gates of St Aurelia's infirmary and never returned. And yet the ledger, with its single chilling word, suggests nothing amiss. At first glance, the building itself betrays no malice. St Aurelia sits at the edge of the town like a guardian, its pale stone facade warmed by the sun, its spire visible above orchards. It had been raised in the late 19th century by an order of nursing, sisters who promised care to the poor, a haven for the injured, and a hospice for the dying. Local villagers often spoke of it with gratitude, for in a valley with no other institution, where winter snows made travel treacherous, the infirmary stood as a sanctuary. Mothers carried fevered children to its doors. Veterans sought solace for their broken bodies. Farmers trusted the sisters more than distant doctors who spoke in cold clinical terms. By all appearances, St Aurelia was a house of mercy, and yet, within its walls, something else unfolded. 14 years marked by a pattern few were willing to notice, let alone name. 214 human beings entered the hospital and, according to its own records, were sent onward. The phrase was gentle, almost religious in its ambiguity, as though it might mean God had called them home. But parish burials do not match the numbers. Families asked questions, and the answers they received were vague, evasive, wrapped in clerical authority. The patient had been moved for special treatment. The patient had been taken into the Lord's embrace. None of these answers were verifiable. The chilling contrast lies here. In a house consecrated for care, a word that should mean mercy, we see instead the arithmetic of erasure. Hospitals are meant to restore, or at the very least to ease passage into death with dignity. Instead, St Aurelia's records describe lives that vanish into a void. The silence of bureaucracy masking the absence of graves. The promise of sanctuary is set against the abyss of disappearance, and it is that tension between what was professed and what was done that frames the entire story to follow. For the townspeople of Griesbach in 1923, this was not yet a scandal, but a whisper carried on cold mountain air. Families grieved quietly, uncertain whether to trust their doubts. Officials kept their eyes down, and priests urged faith rather than questions. Only the ledger remained, mute and damning, a line of ink that no one could erase. To open with that number, 214, is to confront the abyss in its starkest form. It is a number that should not exist in a place of healing, and yet it does. And so the question hangs, where did St Aurelia send them? Before we proceed further, it is important to pause and acknowledge the nature of this material. What follows is a dramatized reconstruction, built from fragments of testimony, incomplete records, and the kind of speculation necessary to fill the gaps left by time. It is not intended to sensationalize suffering, nor to provide lurid detail, but rather to wrestle with the ethical weight of what may have been endured within the walls of St Aurelia's infirmary. For some listeners, especially those with experiences of institutional betrayal, the subject matter may feel raw or unsettling. Consider this a fair warning. The story you are hearing is not only about numbers in a ledger, but about flesh and blood people who lived, trusted, and in many cases, vanished without farewell. Every transfer recorded was once a daughter, a father, a child with laughter in their voice and hopes in their chest. We speak of them not to reduce them further, but to resist the silence that history tried to impose. Equally, this is a dramatization. Conversations and inner thoughts attributed to patients. Doctors or nuns cannot be taken as exact quotations, for many records were destroyed or sealed. Instead, they are careful. Reconstructions drawn from the tone of letters that never reached their families, from depositions given decades later, and from the bureaucratic language preserved in state archives. In building this account, we walk a line between truth and conjecture, always in service of illuminating rather than exploiting. This investigation also asks you, the listener, to consider your own position in the telling of such stories. What does it mean to lend your ears to disappearances that happened a century ago, in a town you may never visit, to people whose names you will never know? Perhaps it is an act of solidarity across time. Perhaps it is also a mirror held up to the institutions you trust in your own day. In that spirit, I invite you to join the community of others who are listening now. Where are you hearing this from? A kitchen at night, a crowded subway, a quiet bedroom? Let us know, because the way stories survive is by being carried together, by being spoken and remembered across distances. As we continue, hold two images side by side. On one hand, a sunlit chapel where nurses in habits walk silently with trays of medicine, where prayers are whispered for the suffering. On the other, a locked archive in which dozens of letters were hidden, unsigned and unsent, where the word transfer appears again and again with no explanation. The first is the image St Aurelia gave to the world. The second is the image uncovered only later, by those unwilling to forget. This, then, is the threshold. Beyond this point, we leave the preface of disclaimers and step into the slow unfolding of suspicion. Into the years, when the first voices dared to ask, what had become of those who entered through St Aurelia's gates and never returned? The valley that cradled Griesbach seemed untouched by the modern world in the first decades of the 20th century. Narrow streets wound between stone cottages, smoke rose in blue columns from wood stoves, and bells from the parish church tolled with a rhythm that marked both work and worship. Life here was built on trust. Trust in the land to yield crops, trust in neighbors to help when storms tore down roofs, and above all, trust in the institutions that promised stability. None was more respected than the infirmary of St Aurelia, its spire visible above the orchards like a sentinel of mercy. To outsiders, the hospital appeared serene. The gardens were tended with meticulous care, medicinal herbs neatly labeled in Latin, roses climbing the cloister walls. Sisters in black habits moved like shadows of devotion, carrying linens through quiet corridors. For families bringing in a sick child or an elderly parent, the sight of these women inspired both awe and relief. They represented not only medical knowledge but spiritual comfort, for each bed was accompanied by whispered prayers. The town called them the Daughters of Aurelia, protectors who worked without complaint. But reverence has a way of blinding the eye. In a community that measured its morality by obedience and faith, questioning the sisters was unthinkable. Parish sermons described the hospital as a sacred refuge. The mayor often praised the order for saving the municipality from financial strain. Without the sisters, the cost of care would have crippled the town's modest budget. Farmers, laborers, widows, everyone seemed indebted to them. It was a bond of gratitude so deep it left little room for suspicion. And yet, if one lingered near the market square or beside the well at dusk, one could hear quieter voices. A mother whispering to a neighbor that her letters to her hospitalized son had gone unanswered. A widow confessing she had never been told where her husband's body was buried. These murmurs were often stifled by a stern response. The sisters know best. To doubt them is to doubt God's will. Publicly, reverence prevailed. Privately, unease seeped through the cracks. The physical setting of St Aurelia itself carried a double meaning. In daylight, the infirmary looked like a sanctuary. Bright corridors where sunlight pooled through stained glass. Polished wood floors scrubbed clean. Crucifixes on the walls offering comfort. At night, however, the same building took on a different cast. The long hallways grew cavernous, shadows stretching like sentinels. Windows rattled in the alpine winds, and lantern light threw uneasy flickers across vaulted ceilings. For townsfolk passing on the road after dark, the hospital appeared less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress, its gates iron, its windows narrow, its silence oppressive. This was the paradox of St Aurelia, the town's greatest source of pride and its most unapproachable mystery. The sisters were at once saviors and wardens, their habits both symbols of piety and veils that concealed what occurred within. People gave thanks at Mass for their service, yet few dared step inside the infirmary unless compelled by illness. To many, it felt less like a hospital and more like a world apart, where the rules of ordinary life no longer applied. That tension between gratitude and fear, sanctuary and fortress, set the stage for what was to come. For while the people of Griesbach trusted too much, St Aurelia asked for that trust without ever fully returning it. In that space of imbalance where reverence silenced questions, disappearances would pass unnoticed for years. Only later, when the whispers grew too many to ignore, would the town reckon with how its faith had blinded it. In the winter of 1910, the first disappearance slipped almost unnoticed into the fabric of town life, folded into grief the way frost folds into the soil. His name was Matthias Huber, though few would remember it later, when only numbers remained. He was a woodcutter, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by alpine winds. For years, villagers had seen him dragging sledges of pine down the mountain paths, his axe ringing in the forests above Griesbach. That year, a sudden fever struck him, a coughing sickness that bent him double and filled his lungs with water. His neighbors carried him down the icy slope, wrapped in blankets, and delivered him to the gates of St Aurelia. To those who brought him, There was relief. The sisters opened their doors swiftly, guiding Matthias into the warm light of the infirmary. Incense lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of antiseptic. One of the sisters pressed a crucifix into his hand as another murmured reassurances. "You are in God's house now." The men who left him there walked away believing he was safe, that the hospital would cradle him back to health, or at the very least ease him into peace. Days passed. His sister Anna came to visit, only to be told that Matthias was no longer there. A young nun at the desk explained that he had been transferred to another facility, better suited to treat his condition. The name of that facility was mumbled quickly, and when Anna asked again, the nun folded her hands and shook her head. "It is in God's keeping now. You must pray." Anna returned home confused but obedient. Who was she to question women sworn to holy vows? Weeks later, Anna began to make inquiries. She sent letters to hospitals in nearby towns, Feldkirch, Innsbruck, Salzburg. The responses came back uniform. They had received no such patient. Parish records listed no burial, and no death certificate bore his name. It was as though Matthias had stepped through the gates of St Aurelia and dissolved into the air. In the town, some muttered explanations. Perhaps he had wandered off delirious. Perhaps the fever had carried him away and the body buried, quickly to prevent contagion. Others shrugged and warned Anna not to trouble herself. To question the sisters was to invite shame upon the family. In public, Anna lowered her eyes and held her tongue, but in private she wept, her grief soured by uncertainty. The contrast could not be sharper. On one side, the promise of healing in a place cloaked in sanctity. On the other, the silence of a bureaucratic word that erased a life. Matthias was the first, or at least the first whose family pressed hard enough to leave a trace in records. A simple entry in the infirmary's ledger. Transferred, 1910, no signature, no destination, just the language of disappearance. Years later, when archivists pored over those ledgers, they found Anna's marginalia, small pencil notes she had written in the parish register. He did not return. No grave found. These faint words became artifacts of doubt, a daughter's attempt to resist forgetting. They were fragile, easily overlooked, but they told us what the official documents refused to say, that a man had vanished where trust should have guaranteed care. The year was 1914, and the winds of war swept across Europe. But in Griesbach, the tragedy that etched itself deepest into memory began with 3 children. They were sisters, Margaret, Elise, and little Clara, daughters of a cooper and his wife who had both succumbed to typhus too. Winters earlier, left parentless, the girls were taken into the parish orphanage, a stone building not far from the infirmary. By all accounts, they were lively, bright-eyed children, inseparable even in hardship. Villagers often saw them skipping along the cobbled streets hand in hand, whispering to one another in a private language only siblings understand. When fever struck them in quick succession, the town reacted with sympathy. A parish collection was taken for their care. Women from the market wrapped the children in extra shawls. The sisters of St Aurelia agreed to admit all 3, a mercy that seemed to reflect the order's vaunted charity. On a rainy evening, they were led through the hospital gates together, Margaret holding Elise's hand, Elise carrying Clara on her hip. Witnesses remembered the smallest girl crying softly. Though whether from sickness or fear no one could say, what happened afterward grew tangled in contradictions. According to the infirmary's records, Margaret was transferred within a week to a sanatorium in Innsbruck, Elise the following month, and Clara shortly thereafter. Yet when parish authorities attempted to confirm the transfers, the institutions in Innsbruck denied receiving them. Their names appeared nowhere in admission logs. Inquiries to Salzburg, Feldkirch, even across the border into Bavaria produced the same reply. No such children had arrived. The orphanage keeper, Frau Brunner, pressed the matter. She wrote letters, demanded answers, and even stood in person at the infirmary gates. The sisters there met her with lowered eyes and careful words. They insisted the children were under treatment elsewhere, that their condition was delicate, and visits discouraged. One sister, speaking more sternly, reminded her that orphans were wards of the parish, not of individual citizens, and advised her to trust in divine providence. Frau Brunner returned unsettled, convinced she had been rebuked for her persistence. In the town square, rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that the girls had died quickly, their small bodies buried in unmarked ground behind the infirmary walls. Others speculated they had been sent away to convent schools, or even adopted in secret by families of higher standing. Each rumor carried its own logic, but none could explain why no official record, no grave, no farewell existed. Mothers with children of their own began to hush their voices when they passed the hospital, clutching little hands more tightly. The contrast in this case was almost unbearable. Orphans embody both innocence and vulnerability. Children who already bore the weight of loss, who relied entirely on the mercy of institutions. Against that innocence stood the cold language of clerical notes. Transferred. No names of guardians, no forwarding addresses, no pastoral blessings. Just the same impenetrable word that had consumed Matthias Huber 4 years earlier. Later discoveries in diocesan archives deepened the unease. Among yellowing parish letters lay a correspondence between two councilmen, both expressing discomfort with the orphan girl's disappearance. One scrawled line read, "If they are with the Lord, then say so. To write otherwise is deception." This fragment, unsigned, remains one of the only surviving acknowledgments that town officials themselves recognized something was wrong. The sisters, however, maintained silence. Publicly, they continued their rounds, administering medicine, praying over patients, offering comfort to the families who still trusted them. The disappearance of 3 orphans was swallowed by the greater calamity of the war, as young men marched off and telegrams of death streamed back. Yet in the quiet margins, grief took root. For Frau Brunner, who had raised the children as her own after their parents' deaths, silence was a cruelty worse than loss. She kept their small belongings folded neatly in a chest at the orphanage, untouched, waiting for answers that never came. It was with the case of these sisters that the first faint pattern emerged, an unease that whispered of repetition. A man vanished, then children, each disappearance marked by the same evasive word. Yet still the town kept its trust, convincing itself that war and disease explained everything. Few yet dared to ask if innocence could disappear so easily. What did that say about the place they had believed to be their refuge? The end of the Great War brought both relief and ruin to Griesbach. Bells rang in the church tower when the armistice was declared. Yet the town square quickly filled with men who returned not as victors, but as fragments of themselves. Some bore shattered limbs. Others stumbled with shrapnel still lodged beneath their skin. Many carried wounds invisible to the eye. Night terrors, tremors, sudden bursts of weeping in daylight. The villagers, who had followed every rumor of the front, welcomed them home with reverence. But few knew how to mend the brokenness the war had left inside these men. It was inevitable that many of them found their way to the gates of St Aurelia. The sisters, cloaked in the authority of both nursing and religion, offered a kind of sanctuary unmatched anywhere else within a day's travel. Families, overwhelmed by the veterans' suffering, trusted the infirmary's promise of care. A mother brought her son who had not spoken a word since Verdun. A wife delivered her husband, who still shook violently at the sound of church bells. They were told the sisters would ease their suffering, that treatments of rest, prayer, and new therapeutic methods would restore them. At first, hope lingered. A veteran named Johann was seen in the infirmary gardens, walking slowly with a crutch, nodding to old friends who passed by the gates. Another, Friedrich, sent a letter to his brother, describing quiet days of repose and prayer. But then the letters stopped. The sightings ended. Families who asked to visit were told the men had been transferred to institutions better equipped for their condition, places in Innsbruck, Salzburg, or Vienna. Yet once again, when families wrote to these hospitals, the replies were identical, no record of admission. This time, however, the discrepancies could not be hidden so easily. Veterans had comrades, friends in arms who noticed their absence. The men who gathered in taverns, nursing both their ale and their scars, spoke openly. Johann would not leave without telling me. Friedrich swore he would be at harvest. Their insistence carried a weight the earlier disappearances had lacked. These were not isolated peasants or unprotected orphans. These were soldiers who had borne the Empire's uniform. To lose them so quietly seemed more than misfortune. It seemed deliberate. The town's contrast deepened. On feast days, the sisters led processions through the streets, their habits fluttering in the wind, lauded as angels of mercy who had tended the sick through years of war. Yet behind closed doors, families whispered of sons and husbands who had vanished within their walls. A shadow grew over the image of sanctity. What kind of sanctuary loses track of men entrusted to its care? What kind of holy order pens the word transferred without explaining where? By 1919, at least a dozen veterans were unaccounted for. Some families pressed harder. They brought their complaints to municipal offices, demanding written confirmation of the transfers. The officials shuffled papers, pointed to stamped documents from the infirmary, and muttered about confidentiality. Behind their desks, however, unease spread. At least one magistrate scrawled a private note in the margin of a file. Contradiction between Aurelia records and army lists. Further inquiry suppressed. That note, discovered decades later in the state archive, is one of the strongest indications that authorities knew more than they admitted. The pain of the veterans' disappearance cut differently than earlier losses. When Matthias vanished, when the orphan girls were swallowed into silence, the town convinced itself that private grief should not disturb communal faith. But the veterans were public figures, sons of the soil, men honored in processions, names engraved on plaques. Their absence struck at civic pride as much as personal sorrow. If those who had faced artillery fire could vanish so completely at home, what safety did anyone else truly have? Still, few dared open confrontation. The war had exhausted the town. Food was scarce, inflation rising, tempers brittle. To accuse the sisters outright would risk both scandal and the collapse of the only medical refuge for miles. So the community remained divided between outward reverence and inner suspicion. Mothers continued to bring feverish children through St Aurelia's gates, even as they whispered prayers that theirs would not be the next name crossed out and marked with that impenetrable word. With the case of the veterans, the disappearances could no longer be dismissed as accidents or isolated tragedies. A pattern had formed, first a lone woodcutter, then orphaned children, now soldiers of the empire itself. What had once been whispered unease began to resemble a ledger of vanishing lives, growing longer with each passing year. In 1920, the state dispatched a physician to the Tyrolean districts whose title was unusual enough to stir both curiosity and apprehension. Alienist. His name was Dr. Leonhard Keppel, a man in his late 40s with a reputation for methodical scrutiny and a sharp distrust of institutions that cloak themselves in sanctity. Alienists, specialists in disorders of the mind and nervous system, were often viewed with suspicion themselves, hovering between medicine and law, tasked to pronounce on sanity, responsibility, and truth. Keppel had spent years in Vienna, writing on the care of veterans broken by shell shock, and he had little patience for evasive language. Keppel arrived in Griesbach under the pretext of assessing the region's capacity to handle war-traumatized soldiers. Officially, he was to inspect hospitals, review treatments, and recommend reforms. Unofficially, whispers had reached the provincial office. Families complained of missing patients, army records contradicted hospital accounts, and St. Aurelia's name surfaced again and again. The authorities, unwilling to accuse a religious institution outright, sent Keppel as their surrogate. He carried both the authority of science and the plausible neutrality of clinical assessment. From the moment he stepped into St. Aurelia, Keppel noted discrepancies. The building, though orderly and serene, bore the air of something concealed. Corridors led to locked wings whose keys were said to be with the mother, superior, patient. Registers were written in two hands, some with elegant calligraphy, others in a hurried scrawl that skipped entire lines. Dates of admission and discharge often overlapped impossibly, with the same patient appearing to have been transferred and yet still listed in the infirmary. Census weeks later, Keppel's training taught him to read not only documents, but silences. When he asked a sister about one veteran's transfer, she folded her hands and recited the explanation as though memorized. He was taken to Innsbruck. When pressed for the name of the attending physician there, she fell quiet. In his notes, Keppel underlined the phrase mechanical response. He would later write that the staff seemed less like caregivers and more like sentinels guarding a script. Outside the infirmary, he began interviewing families. A widow named Frau Steiner produced the last letter she had received from her husband, a soldier suffering from what was then called war nerves. The letter, written in shaky script, spoke of his wish to come home by Easter. Yet Easter came and went, and the infirmary claimed he had been moved to Salzburg. The hospital in Salzburg, when queried, denied any knowledge of him. Keppel tucked the letter into his satchel, an artifact he believed more honest than the official record. The contrast here was stark. The sisters wore their habits as symbols of piety, insisting that obedience and silence were acts of devotion. Keppel, by contrast, carried the tools of reason, ledgers, testimonies, forensic scrutiny. Faith versus science, obedience versus inquiry, devotion versus doubt. In the valleys of Tyrol, the balance usually favored faith. But Keppel represented a new authority, one that could not easily be dismissed as impious meddling. Still, his presence drew tension. Some townsfolk welcomed him quietly, whispering their suspicions in his ear, while others crossed themselves and muttered that probing too deeply into holy institutions would invite ruin. Keppel himself walked a careful line, writing in his official dispatches only of irregularities in record-keeping and inconsistencies in transfer documentation. Yet in his private journal, he was more blunt. There is a pattern of disappearance. The institution guards its secrets with the language of God. But the truth is administrative void. Where men and children have gone, no one will say. It was in these early weeks of inquiry that Keppel began to sensed the magnitude of the mystery. 1 or 2 vanished patients could be dismissed. 200 suggested something systemic. He resolved to dig deeper, not yet realizing that in doing so he was setting himself against an institution that had perfected the art of silence. The discovery was almost accidental, as so many turning points in investigations tend to be. Dr. Leonhard Keppel had spent several weeks combing through the official ledgers of St Aurelia, tracing columns of names, diagnoses, and transfers that seemed written to soothe rather than to inform. He had grown frustrated at how neatly the records avoided contradiction. Each discharge tied up with a vague note of relocation. Each death accounted for with just enough ritual language to silence questions. It was as though the documents had been written with an audience in mind. Not families, not fellow physicians, but auditors whose eyes could be distracted by a careful flourish of penmanship. One afternoon, while waiting for the Mother Superior to grant him access to a locked wing, Keppel wandered the chapel vestry. The small room smelled of beeswax and old incense, its shelves crowded with liturgical texts and hymnals. A cabinet against the wall stood slightly ajar. Inside were stacks of prayer books, mismatched and weathered. But tucked behind them, he noticed a wooden box bound with a corroded clasp. It was not catalogued, not labeled, and when he pulled it free, dust rose in a cloud that stung his nose. Within lay a book, roughly bound, its pages thick and yellowed, the ink uneven. Unlike the ornate handwriting of the infirmary's official register, this volume was stark, utilitarian. Each line bore initials instead of names, dates of admission, and beside them cryptic marks, crosses, circles, slashes. Some entries were followed by short Latin words, absum, silere, mutus. To Keppel, trained in classical languages, the meanings chilled him. Absent, silent, mute. This was not a record meant for inspection. It was a private code, a ledger hidden away in the most sacred space of the institution. The irony struck him sharply. Holy Scripture on one shelf, and beside it, what appeared to be a tally of vanished lives. The contrast could not have been more violent. The Word of God versus the arithmetic of disappearance. Keppel turned the pages slowly, realizing that the timeline stretched back to 1910, aligning precisely with the year Matthias Huber had vanished. Over 14 years, the book logged more than 200 entries. Some pages bore smudges of candle wax, as if they had been written hurriedly in dim light. At the margins, there were annotations in different hands, numbers recalculated, symbols crossed out, phrases like receptum est, it has been received. The implication was impossible to ignore. This was not a mere duplicate of the official register. It was a shadow archive, preserved in secrecy. Later, when fragments of this ledger were photographed by archivists, they would circulate as artifacts of proof. One page in particular drew fascination. A cluster of entries dated Easter week, 1915, corresponding with the disappearance of the 3 orphan sisters. Their initials, M.H., E.H., K.H., were marked with 3 crosses side by side. In the margin, in smaller script, someone had written Sororis Clause. Keppel's translation, scribbled in his notebook, was terse. The sisters enclosed. He felt a tremor of both discovery and dread. As a physician, he was accustomed to confronting suffering. But this was something else. An organized record of human erasure, concealed under the guise of prayer and piety. He copied several lines into his notes, careful not to alert the sisters that he had uncovered the book. He slid it back into the box, pressed the clasp, and returned the cabinet to its place. To seize the volume outright would have exposed him, and he knew he needed time to build a case. That evening, in his lodgings, Keppel wrote by lamplight. The ledger exists in 2 faces. The one they show the world, filled with healing words. The one they hide, filled with codes of silence. The first comforts the faithful, the second condemns the lost. I must learn to read what these marks truly mean. For the first time, he held tangible evidence that the rumors were not mere grief-fed fantasies. There was an internal system at work, one designed to conceal rather than to reveal. And yet, he also realized the danger. If such a ledger had been hidden in the chapel, it meant the sisters themselves, or at least some among them, understood the need to guard it from scrutiny. To uncover it was to place himself on the line between knowledge and peril. Do you want me to now continue into the section where Keppel pushes against institutional silence, town officials and church leaders, deflecting his findings, even as suspicion grows? When Keppel attempted to bring his findings into the open, he discovered that the greatest obstacle was not ignorance but silence, woven into the very fabric of the town's institutions. Griesbach, like so many Alpine communities, lived in a delicate balance between parish authority, municipal governance, and the ever-present influence of the diocese. To disturb that balance was to invite instability, And in 1920, after years of war, hunger, and economic strain, stability was prized above truth. His first step was cautious. Keppel met with the mayor in a small, wood-paneled office that smelled of tobacco and ink. He laid out his observations: contradictory transfer records, families unable to locate their relatives, and the troubling secondary ledger he had discovered. The mayor listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled before him. When Keppel finished, the man exhaled slowly and replied with practiced vagueness, "Doctor, the Sisters of St Aurelia have served this town faithfully for decades. They care for our poor, they ease our dying, and they do so at no cost to the municipality. To accuse them is to endanger not only their reputation, but the welfare of every citizen who depends on them. I must advise discretion." In that moment, Keppel recognized the political machinery at work. The infirmary was not simply a hospital. It was a shield for the town's conscience. To question it was to risk unraveling the moral identity of Griesbach itself. Silence became a civic duty. He turned to the parish council next, hoping that men of faith might at least demand clarity from their own order of sisters. The meeting was held in the rectory, where crucifixes hung over the door and the scent of incense lingered in the drapery. Again, Keppel laid out his case, this time producing copies of correspondence from families who had received no confirmation of transfers. The council listened gravely, but when he mentioned the hidden ledger, their faces hardened. One deacon finally spoke. "Doctor, records are for the earthly world. Our sisters keep their vows before God. It is not for us to question their methods of mercy." This was the wall he struck again and again, the conflation of piety with immunity. In the eyes of civic and ecclesiastical leaders, to probe St Aurelia too deeply was not merely disruptive, it was sacrilegious. They couched their refusal in words of faith, but beneath them lay fear, the fear of scandal, the fear of collapse, the fear that their own complicity might be exposed if the infirmary's practices came to light. The contrast here was brutal. On one side stood Keppel with his documents, evidence scrawled in ink, testimonies from widows and mothers, fragments of proof gathered in patient detail. On the other side stood men whose power rested on words of reassurance, on phrases like God's will and charitable, sovereignty, science, and inquiry faced off against obedience and silence. Truth pressed against the weight of authority, and the latter prevailed. Among the surviving documents from this period is a set of sealed minutes from a town meeting in November 1920, when unsealed decades later, they revealed only the vaguest acknowledgement of Keppel's concerns. Certain irregularities noted, not to be pursued further. Discussion closed. That closing line, written in a clerk's careful script, is perhaps the most damning artifact of all, not proof of conspiracy, but of willful blindness. The alienists' reports to Vienna grew sharper. Though couched in professional language, I observe resistance among local officials to any inquiry that might diminish confidence in the sisters' work. The matter cannot be resolved through local channels. His private journal was blunter still. I am speaking into a void. They would rather preserve the image of sanctity than confront the fact of disappearance. Silence is their answer, silence their shield. It was at this point that Keppel realized he was no longer merely cataloging anomalies. He was pushing against a wall of institutional refusal, one that stretched from town hall to parish altar. Every path he pursued ended in the same void: polite deflection, closed doors, vague assurances. And behind that silence, the number of missing patients continued to grow. The first breach in the wall of silence came not from officials or clergy, but from the patients themselves. Voices carried forward only because their words had been misplaced, hidden, or intercepted before they could be destroyed. Keppel gained access to them almost by chance. A junior clerk at the post office, sympathetic to his inquiries, slipped him a small packet of envelopes that had never been delivered. They had been marked "Return to Sender" in heavy ink, but the addresses and signatures revealed they originated from St Aurelia. When Keppel opened them in his lodgings, what spilled out were not formal communications but raw fragments of human desperation. One letter, dated August 1918, was written in a trembling hand. "Dear Marta, they say I'm not fit to leave, but my body is strong now. I hear the bells each morning, but I cannot walk to see you. Please come, they will not tell me when I may go." Another bore no salutation at all, only a frantic plea. "They move us at night. The rooms are emptying. If you do not hear from me, believe that I loved you." The most striking of these letters came from a child. The handwriting was uneven, the spelling halting, but the voice unmistakable. "Sister says we are going to heaven soon. She says we must not cry. I am afraid. Please tell Papa I did try to be good." The paper was blotched, as though with tears. though Keppel could not be certain. He held it for a long time before setting it aside, shaken by the contrast between the innocence of the words and the enormity of what they implied. Here at last were artifacts that pierced the veil of official silence. Where the ledgers reduced human beings to initials and symbols, these letters carried the resonance of living voices, an emotional record, impossible to reconcile with the institution's image of mercy. Their existence revealed something else as well. Surveillance. For if the letters never reached their destinations, it meant someone within St Aurelia was intercepting them, choosing which words might leave the walls and which must be buried. Keppel documented each letter meticulously, noting dates, handwriting, and intended recipients. He began to sketch a chronology in the margins of his notebook, aligning the voices with the hidden ledger. Patterns emerged, clusters of vanished patients coinciding with certain feast days, entries marked with crosses in the secret register echoing the dates of letters that trailed off into silence. He was beginning to see the contours of a system, though its purpose remained obscured. The contrast sharpened unbearably in his mind. St Aurelia's public face was one of compassion, a sanctuary where prayers rose with incense. But behind closed doors, in the intercepted words of the suffering, was a narrative of confinement, fear, and impending erasure. Sanctuary versus captivity, mercy versus menace. The two realities existed in parallel, never acknowledged together except in these forgotten scraps of correspondence. At the next gathering of families, an informal circle of women who met in a tavern back room, Keppel read selected passages aloud. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Some wept openly. Others grew rigid with fury. One widow stood and declared, "They have taken not only our husbands and sons, but their words, their very breath." For these families, the letters became sacred artifacts, proof that their grief was not madness, but testimony ignored. Historians would later argue that these unsent letters marked a turning point. Unlike statistical records or bureaucratic registers, they could not be dismissed as clerical error or miscommunication. They carried an intimacy that made denial impossible. Yet even armed with these voices, Keppel faced the same resistance when he attempted to present them formally. The mayor refused to acknowledge them as legitimate evidence. The parish council dismissed them as hallucinations of the unwell. The diocese warned him not to be deceived by scribblings of the afflicted. And still he pressed on, convinced that the letters were fragments of truth that could unravel the entire fabric of deception. He knew that such voices, once extinguished, could not speak again. His task was to preserve them, to let them testify even when the living had been silenced. By the winter of 1920, it was no longer possible for Keppel to move through the halls of St Aurelia unnoticed. The sisters, once politely distant, now watched him with a sharpened attentiveness. Conversations ceased when he entered a room. Doors that had been left ajar now closed softly in his presence. His requests for patient files were met with delays, explanations of misplacement, or assurances that Mother Superior will provide them when convenient. At first, the obstruction was subtle. An appointment rescheduled, a clerk who failed to appear, a ledger inexplicably missing for a day before reappearing with fresh ink. But soon it took on a more deliberate edge. One morning Keppel arrived to find his satchel, which he had left locked in his lodgings, sitting on a table in the infirmary library. The papers within had been disturbed, the order of his notes altered. He said nothing, but in his journal that evening he recorded, "They wish me to know that they can reach me anywhere." Witnesses later recalled seeing two sisters follow him as he walked through the town square, their presence quiet but unmistakable. On another occasion, a parishioner confided that word had spread from the pulpit, a warning that foreign doctors sought to sow discord and diminish the sacred labor of the convent. Keppel was careful never to confront the sisters directly. He knew that a misstep could be construed as an attack on their piety, which would only harden the community against him. Still, the pressure was undeniable. This was the phase of intimidation that investigators often describe. Not overt violence, but a steady narrowing of one's movements, a tightening of the noose of surveillance. For Keppel, the contrast became deeply personal. He had come armed with science, reason, and compassion for the families who longed for truth. Now he found himself beset by an institution wielding silence as a weapon, turning faith into a shield, and community loyalty into a tool of suppression. His rational inquiry was being met not with debate, but with quiet menace. Artifacts from this period show his unease. A letter to a colleague in Vienna, preserved in state archives, reads, "I sense that I am being permitted only what they wish me to see, and even then under watchful eyes. The sisters are not merely caregivers. They are guardians of something hidden, something they believe more vital than the well-being of those in their charge. He did not name the ledger or the letters explicitly, perhaps fearing interception, but his language conveyed a growing urgency. The families, too, noticed the change. Some reported that their visits were shortened, or that they were turned away on the pretext of quarantine. A mother recounted being told her son was too restless for visitors, and then never hearing of him again. Each obstruction deepened the suspicion that the infirmary was closing ranks, fortifying its walls against scrutiny. The very institution meant to embody mercy had become a fortress of denial. The tension in town sharpened. Keppel would walk through the marketplace and feel the weight of eyes upon him, some filled with gratitude, others with suspicion. He was caught between two communities, the grieving, who clung to him as their last hope for answers, and the faithful loyalists, who saw in him a threat to the sanctity of St Aurelia. Sanctuary versus exposure, devotion versus inquiry, the contrasts that had defined his investigation were now manifest in the very streets he walked. In his private writings, he confessed moments of fear. I sleep lightly now, aware that every creak in the stair may not be innocent. Yet if I withdraw, their silence triumphs, and the voices of the vanished will remain buried. The question is not whether I am watched, but how long I can withstand it. It was becoming clear that he was no longer simply an observer. He had become a participant in the struggle, a figure against whom the institution actively maneuvered. The stakes had shifted, from mere irregularities in record-keeping to a battle over whether the truth could survive at all. It was on a night thick with snow, when the bells of Griesbach were muffled under drifts, that Keppel made his most dangerous move. He had grown convinced that whatever St Aurelia was hiding, it would not be found in the ledgers alone. Too much of the pattern suggested physical concealment, patients transferred, yet never arriving elsewhere. Wings that remained locked for years, whispers of sounds beneath the chapel floor. If the sisters had created a system of erasure, he reasoned, there must be a place where the traces lingered. He waited until late, feigning retirement to his lodgings, and then returned by a side path to the infirmary grounds. The snow helped to mask his steps. Carrying only a lantern and a small crowbar, he moved with the unease of a man who knew discovery could end his work, his reputation, perhaps even his life. He had no warrant, no official sanction for what he was about to do. What he carried instead was desperation, a need to see with his own eyes what so many families suspected. Inside, the corridors were silent, save for the faint creak of the building in the wind. He passed the chapel, his lantern beam catching gilt edges of icons, and descended toward the vestry. It was there that he noticed a section of paneling at the base of the wall that appeared newer than the rest, its wood less darkened by age. Kneeling, he pressed the edge of the crowbar against the seam. The panel shifted slightly, revealing the outline of a door long unused. The air that seeped out was stale, carrying the scent of damp stone. He pried further until the panel gave way, revealing a narrow stair descending into darkness. Lantern in hand, he began his descent. The steps were rough, uneven, cut directly into the rock. At the bottom lay a chamber hewn from the earth itself. What he found there would later be described in his notes with clinical detachment, though the words betray an undercurrent of horror. The chamber was lined with cots, their mattresses bare, some stained with mildew. Chains dangled from the walls, their iron rings rusted but intact. Along one side stood cabinets filled with jars, labeled tinctures, powders, vials of unknown solutions. On a table lay a stack of folded garments, patient smocks, each marked with initials in faded ink. Some still bore the embroidered crosses the sisters used to denote ownership. Artifacts were scattered everywhere. A rosary with beads broken and strung again on twine. A child's wooden toy cracked at the base. A journal half burned, its remaining pages scrawled with prayers that shifted midway into incoherent pleas. Keppel copied a passage that survived. They say we are chosen, but chosen for what? The silence is worse than death. This was no infirmary ward. It was a hidden chamber of confinement, its existence carefully walled away from public sight. The contrast was unbearable. Above ground, the chapel where hymns rose with incense. Below, a cellar of absence, where the vanished left only their belongings and words. Sanctuary versus prison, salvation versus erasure. Keppel forced himself to catalog as much as he could. He sketched the room in rough outline, noting the placement of cots, the number of jars, the initials stitched into the garments. His physician's mind compelled him to record even in the face of revulsion. He understood that once he left, there might never again be an opportunity to see this hidden place. And yet, even as he worked, he felt the cold press of danger. The sound of steps above, soft, deliberate, made him extinguish his lantern and press himself against the wall. He waited, breath shallow, until the silence returned. Only then did he retreat, replacing the panel as best he could, leaving the chamber sealed once more. Back in his room that night, his hands shook as he wrote. The institution is not merely negligent, it is complicit. The chamber proves an intention to conceal. This is not error, it is design. He folded his notes carefully, tucking them beneath the lining of his coat. In that moment, the investigation transformed. What had begun as an inquiry into missing records was now an accusation of systematic disappearance, backed by physical proof. But Keppel knew, perhaps more keenly than ever, that such proof placed him in grave peril. For if he had found the chamber, then surely the sisters, or those who guarded their secrets, knew that he might reveal it. When the thaw of early spring came to Tyrol in 1921, Keppel carried with him the weight of what he had seen in the hidden chamber. He knew he could not keep his discovery confined to his private notes. It demanded official recognition. With care, he drafted a formal report to the provincial health ministry in Innsbruck. His language was precise, stripped of sensationalism. He described unauthorized confinement quarters, unaccounted patient effects, and systematic irregularities in discharge documentation. He enclosed sketches of the chamber, transcriptions of intercepted letters, and a copy of the clandestine ledger entries he had managed to reproduce. When he traveled to present the dossier in person, he expected at least cautious interest. Instead, he was met with an atmosphere of unease. The ministry clerk who received him glanced nervously at the documents, then quickly ushered him into a side office. There, a senior official thanked him for his diligence, assured him the matter would be reviewed, and advised him not to discuss his findings publicly. The tone was courteous, but beneath it lay an unmistakable warning. This was to remain contained. Over the following weeks, Keppel received no response. When he inquired, he was told that his report was under consideration. Yet in town he began to hear murmurs that he had been rebuked by the authorities, though no such rebuke had been given formally. It was as if his findings had been inverted, turned against him by rumor. A parish notice appeared soon after, extolling the service of the sisters and cautioning the faithful against the dangers of worldly slander. The timing was no coincidence. This was institutional, suppression in its most insidious form, not an outright denial, but a quiet burial. Officials who might have been expected to demand investigation instead closed ranks, more concerned with protecting stability than exposing truth. The contrast was merciless, a man of science bringing evidence in good faith, met by institutions more devoted to preserving image than to justice. Inquiry versus preservation, exposure versus containment. Artifacts from this stage survive in fragments. One is a terse memorandum stamped with the ministry's seal. St Aurelia Infirmary. No irregularities requiring intervention at present. Continued oversight unnecessary. No mention of Keppel's chamber. The letters, or the ledger. Another is a private note, later found among Keppel's belongings, where he wrote in frustration, "Their silence is not ignorance, it is choice. They have decided that absence is preferable to scandal. In this they are complicit." Meanwhile, pressure within Griesbach mounted. Families who had once rallied around Keppel now found themselves intimidated. A widow reported that a deacon warned her not to meet with him again, lest she be denied church burial rites. Another woman, whose husband had vanished from the infirmary, confessed that she could not risk speaking further. "I have children. I must think of them." The very community that had looked to him for truth was being silenced by fear of reprisal. Keppel himself began to feel the isolation closing in. In Vienna, his colleagues grew distant, reluctant to attach themselves to his work. Letters he sent to medical journals went unanswered. He was becoming a man marked by suspicion, not by what he had proven, but by the disruption his proof represented. He wrote bitterly in his journal, "Truth itself has no patron when it threatens the order of things. The missing are missing twice, first from their families, then from history." This phase of suppression would later be described by historians as the most decisive, for if provincial authorities had acted, the chamber could have been exposed, the ledger authenticated, the letters validated. Instead, everything was folded back into silence, allowing St Aurelia to continue unchallenged. It was not merely the sisters who erased lives, it was the institutions meant to safeguard justice that erased the evidence of their erasure. By midsummer of 1921, Keppel had reached a breaking point. The provincial ministry had buried his report, the parish denounced him obliquely, and the town grew colder toward his presence with each passing week. Yet the chamber he had seen in the bowels of St Aurelia haunted him like a specter. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rusted rings in the stone, the rows of cots, the abandoned belongings of those who had no graves. Suppression had not extinguished the truth. It had only made it fester inside him. In his journal, He scrawled a decisive line. If no authority will see, I must bring proof into the light myself. It was then he resolved to return to the infirmary, not to observe or inquire, but to seize what could not be denied. He believed that if he could secure a physical artifact, the hidden ledger itself, or even garments stitched with initials, he might bypass local obstruction and deliver it directly to sympathetic hands in Vienna. Keppel planned with the precision of a surgeon. He knew the sisters' routines, the hours when matins left the halls empty, the creak of certain boards, the ways lamplight spilled across the courtyard. He chose a night of storm, when thunder might cover the sound of his movements. Armed with only his lantern, his crowbar, and a leather satchel, he crossed the threshold of St Aurelia once more. The descent into the vestry passage felt different this time. No longer an investigator moving cautiously under pretense of inspection. He was an intruder, driven by desperation. The panel gave way as before, and the stair led him down into the cold chamber. Yet something had changed. The air was fresher, disturbed, as though the place had been entered recently. On the cots lay fewer garments than he remembered. Cabinets that had once held jars were partly emptied. He felt the dread realization that the sisters, or whoever maintained the chamber, had begun to erase even this evidence. The proof he sought was vanishing before his eyes. With frantic determination, he searched the cabinets and discovered, tucked behind a shelf, a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were pages torn from the coded ledger, margins filled with annotations in at least 2 distinct hands. He stuffed them into his satchel, his pulse pounding. That was when he heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps descending the stone stairs. Not one set, but several. He extinguished his lantern at once, plunging the chamber into darkness. The voices that followed were hushed, unmistakably female, reciting fragments of prayer. Keppel pressed himself against the wall, scarcely daring to breathe. The sisters were coming. In the pitch black, the contrast became absolute. Above ground, St Aurelia was the image of holy order. Bells and hymns, candles and supplication. Here below, the same voices descended like wardens, protectors not of souls but of silence, mercy and menace, indistinguishable in the dark. The footsteps grew closer, then paused. A lantern was struck, its faint glow illuminating the chamber. Keppel saw the outlines of 3 sisters in their habits. One bent to inspect the cabinets, another fingered the chains on the wall. They spoke softly, in tones too low for him to fully discern, but the cadence was unmistakably ritualistic. Then one sister's head turned sharply, her eyes scanning the darkened corner where Keppel crouched. For a moment, time held its breath. He tightened his grip on the satchel, certain that discovery meant ruin. But just then, thunder cracked above, rattling the walls, and the sisters' attention shifted. They murmured a brief prayer and turned back toward the stairs, the lantern casting their shadows grotesquely long against the stone. As their footsteps receded, Keppel forced himself to wait, counting each second until silence returned. Only then did he slip from his hiding place, every muscle trembling. He climbed back to the vestry, replaced the panel with shaking hands, and stumbled into the storm. Rain lashed his face as though to cleanse him, but he clutched the satchel to his chest as one clutches a lifeline. In that moment, he understood how perilously close he had come to being erased himself. Later, in his notes, he wrote, "I entered to preserve the voices of the vanished, and nearly became one of them. The chamber is no longer hidden from me, but I am no longer hidden from them." This was the confrontation he had dreaded, and yet could not avoid. He now possessed proof more damning than any testimony. Fragments of the very ledger the sisters had guarded. But he also knew he had crossed an invisible line. From this night onward, he was not merely an investigator. He was a hunted witness. Keppel did not sleep the night after his perilous return to the chamber. He sat at his desk with the bundle of torn ledger pages spread before him, the lamplight trembling as though it shared his exhaustion. The annotations stared back at him in stark black ink, symbols, Latin phrases, and initials that corresponded all too clearly with families he knew, people who had begged him for answers. Some marks had been overwritten, as though the scribe had tried to obliterate them. Others bore secondary notes, Receptum est, beside 3 consecutive entries, in nocte, scrawled across a margin. He felt as though he were reading not merely records, but verdicts delivered in secret. By dawn, he had resolved to smuggle the papers to Vienna. If the provincial authorities in Innsbruck had chosen to suppress him, perhaps in the capital, where politics were wider, where scrutiny was sharper, someone might listen. He folded the sheets into an envelope, wrapped it in cloth, and concealed it in the false bottom of his satchel. To a colleague in the psychiatric faculty, he addressed a letter. "I urge you to hold these documents in safekeeping. Should I not arrive in person, consider them testimony of what has transpired in Tyrol." His first attempt to leave Griesbach failed almost immediately, At the train station, a uniformed man he did not recognize approached him, speaking with forced courtesy. "Doctor, the sisters have requested your presence for consultation. It would be unwise to depart just now." The phrasing was not a command, but the implication was unmistakable. Keppel feigned agreement, returned to his lodgings, and wrote furiously in his journal, "They have sealed even the roads of exit. My movements are no longer my own." Days stretched into weeks. Each time he attempted to send correspondence, it was returned or delayed. The sympathetic clerk at the post office who had once provided him intercepted letters had been transferred without explanation. On one occasion, Keppel gave a parcel to a farmer traveling to Innsbruck, only to learn later that the man had been stopped on the road by parish officials and the package confiscated. The net was tightening. The contrast between freedom and confinement, so stark in the hidden chamber, was now playing out in his own life. He was no prisoner, yet he was not free. The town had become a living extension of St Aurelia's silence. Conversations stopped when he entered taverns. Children who had once greeted him with curiosity now looked away under their parents' stern gazes. The alienist who had come as a healer was being recast as a danger. Artifacts from this stage reveal his desperation. A half-burned note found among his effects reads, "They will not allow me to leave with the truth. If I cannot escape, I must entrust the fragments to one who can." The handwriting is rushed, the edges of the paper singed, as though he feared even the act of writing would betray him. What unsettled him most were the subtle intrusions. More than once, he returned to his room to find his belongings shifted, his journal lying open on the wrong page. Once, his lantern was left extinguished though he had lit it before leaving. He began to suspect that he was being watched, not only in public, but in the privacy of his quarters. The sisters' reach, or perhaps their allies, extended further than he had imagined. Yet Keppel was not entirely without allies. A widow named Frau Steiner, whose husband's letter he had preserved months earlier, offered to conceal the ledger fragments within a chest. Of wool she traded in Innsbruck. He accepted, though with heavy reluctance, fearing to endanger her. She pressed his hand and said, "Doctor, if we all stay silent, then they have already won." But before the plan could be carried out, Steiner's cottage was searched by parish officials, under the guise of collecting taxes. The chest was overturned. Though nothing was found, the fragments remained still, hidden in Keppel's satchel. The warning was clear. Any who aided him would suffer consequences. He now faced a harrowing choice. To remain in Griesbach was to live under suffocating scrutiny. His every move anticipated and contained. To flee openly was impossible. The station and roads were watched. That left only the most dangerous option: to vanish as the patients had vanished. To slip through the cracks rather than walk the official paths. In his journal, the final entry from this period reads, "The ledger speaks more clearly than I can. If I am silenced, these pages must not be. I must become as invisible as they were made, long enough to carry their voices beyond these mountains." The stage was set for escape, not of triumph, but of survival. Keppel had proof, but proof mattered little if he could not outmaneuver those who sought to bury both him and the truth he carried. The first snows of late autumn gave Keppel his chance. The mountain passes that had once confined him now promised concealment. With the valleys muffled in white and roads less traveled, he reasoned the parish watchers would be slower to react. He dressed plainly, carried only what he could bear, and concealed the ledger fragments within a tin canister wrapped in oilcloth. His plan was not to take the train or the carriage road, but to follow the smugglers' trails known only to shepherds and hunters, paths that wound through ravines and forests where no official patrol would waste their strength. On the night of his flight, the bells of St Aurelia tolled for vespers. He waited until the sound died, then slipped from his lodgings with his satchel strapped tight to his chest. Snow fell in great heavy flakes, a curtain that blurred the outlines of buildings. He crossed the frozen river on foot, boots crunching softly, and entered the black of the forest. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the low moan of wind through pines, felt amplified, as though the entire landscape bore witness to his escape. He had scarcely covered 2 miles when he realized he was not alone. At first it was only a sense, a pressure at his back. Then faintly, the sound of voices carried through the trees. Female voices reciting prayers in Latin, the syllables distorted by the storm but unmistakable in cadence. He pressed himself into the snow shadow of a fallen tree, heart hammering, as 3 lanterns bobbed in the distance. The sisters had come, or perhaps those who acted on their behalf. The contrast could not have been sharper. Prayer as pursuit, faith as net, holiness cloaked in menace. Keppel forced himself onward, deeper into the forest. He abandoned the main trail for narrower paths that cut across the slope. Branches tore at his clothes, snow soaked his boots, but he pressed forward. More than once he stumbled, once striking his knee so hard against a hidden rock that he nearly cried out. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood, reminding himself that any sound could be his undoing. In his satchel, the canister seemed to burn with weight. He thought of the entries within, the names and dates, the scraps of human existence reduced to symbols in a ledger. Each step became an act of carrying those voices out of silence. Yet with each step, the voices behind him grew nearer. At one point he heard a shout, not prayer but command. "There! He is ahead!" Artifacts from this pursuit survive in fragmented form. A hunter's diary from that winter mentions a man in the forest, running as though the devil chased him. A constable's log records an anonymous tip of a doctor traveling toward the Brenner Pass in unlawful flight. These accounts, scattered and incomplete, suggest that Keppel's escape was both seen and ignored, witnessed by ordinary people, but claimed by no one. As though fear had paralyzed them, hours turned into a night of ceaseless motion. The snow thickened, blanketing tracks, yet the lanterns persisted at his back. Once he turned to look and saw only darkness, and he allowed himself a sliver of hope. But as he crested a ridge, the sound returned, this time closer, the crunch of boots echoing his own. He realized with icy certainty that he was being herded, forced away from the safer pass toward a gorge where cliffs hemmed the path. The storm reached its height in that gorge. Wind howled through the narrow walls, carrying with it the echoes of voices both real and imagined. Keppel staggered, nearly blind, the satchel dragging him down like ballast. His strength was failing. For the first time he considered burying the canister in the snow, leaving it hidden for someone braver, or luckier, to find. But then he thought of Frau Steiner, of the grieving families, of the patients whose names had been crossed out without explanation. If he surrendered the proof now, he would become just another vanishing, another silence. At dawn, frost clung to his beard, his hands numb and stiff. He had reached the edge of the gorge, where a wooden footbridge spanned the river below. Half-rotted planks swayed in the storm. He stepped onto it, praying the structure would hold. Behind him, he heard the lanterns break through the snow once more. Shouts echoed, urging him to stop. He did not look back. Crossing that bridge was less an act of escape than a test of faith, not in God, whom he no longer trusted, but in the strength of wood and the will of a man who carried voices of the silenced. When he reached the far side, he did not stop. He plunged into the trees again, his body battered but his satchel intact. For now, he had survived. Yet the pursuit was far from over. The gorge marked not safety, but the beginning of the final chase, one that would determine whether the ledger fragments would ever see the light of Vienna, or whether they, like their keeper, would be swallowed by the mountains forever. The day after Keppel's desperate crossing of the gorge was marked by silence as profound as the storm. Had been violent. Snow muffled the valleys, and the forest seemed emptied of sound except for the caw of distant crows. Yet he knew, with a certainty bred of fear, that he was not alone. Every pause he took to steady his breath seemed echoed by another deeper rhythm. He no longer wondered if he was pursued, only how close. The path toward Vienna required him to pass through a cluster of alpine hamlets, each little more than a scattering of chalets, a church spire, and a storehouse. He entered the first at dusk, hoping to barter a meal and perhaps secure a horse. But at the sight of his worn boots and snow-caked satchel, the villagers stiffened. They offered him bread but nothing more. An old man muttered, "The sisters are looking for you." A woman, tightening a shawl around her shoulders, refused to meet his gaze. It was clear that word had traveled faster than his feet, and that the parish influence extended even here, where distance should have offered refuge. That night he slept in a barn, hidden under straw, the satchel pressed against his chest. He dreamed of the ledger's symbols marching across the page, each one transforming into a face, each face into a voice, and every voice whispering the same phrase. "Do not let them take us back." He woke in terror, his throat raw from a scream he had not realized he uttered. By morning, the hunt was no longer shadows but form. On the road beyond the hamlet, he glimpsed two figures in habits walking with steady purpose, their lanterns extinguished now that daylight made them unnecessary. Accompanying them were two men in heavy coats, parish constables, their rifles slung casually but ominously. Keppel turned from the road and ascended into the trees, abandoning any thought of the direct route. The higher he climbed, the thinner the air and the more treacherous the ground. Snow gave way to ice. Rocks were slick beneath his boots. Still he pressed forward, every step powered by the conviction that the fragments he carried were worth more than his life. Below, the voices of his pursuers echoed. sometimes near, sometimes far, as though the mountains themselves conspired to carry their sound upward to him. Here the contrast was absolute. One man against an institution, his body frail, his spirit tested, and yet in his hands he carried a weight that the institution feared enough to marshal all its silence against him. Faith professed as mercy had become a snare of secrecy. His own frailty became a form of strength, for only the desperate dare such paths. The confrontation came at twilight. As he descended a narrow ravine where the trail narrowed to a ledge above, a frozen river, a figure emerged ahead. A sister stood, veiled and immovable, as though she had been waiting all along. Behind him he heard boots crunching. The constables had closed in. Keppel was trapped, hemmed in by ice and stone. The sister spoke not with anger, but with the calm certainty of one who believes she carries divine sanction. "Doctor, these papers do not belong to you. They belong to the house of God. Hand them over, and you may return safely." Keppel clutched the satchel tighter. His lips cracked with cold, his voice hoarse, but his reply was steady. "They do not belong to you either. They belong to the families, to the dead." For a heartbeat silence. Then the constables moved forward. Keppel stumbled back, his boots skidding on ice. He swung the satchel across his body, as though to shield it, and made a decision born of desperation. He would rather consign the fragments to the river than see them return to the silence of the chamber. In one motion, he tore the canister from the satchel and raised it high above the gorge. The constables froze, realizing the stakes. One shouted, "Stop him!" But the sister merely extended a hand, her voice still soft. "You would not dare." The moment stretched thin as glass. Then Keppel hurled the canister into the river below. It struck the ice, cracked through, and vanished into the current with a muffled splash. A gasp escaped the sister's lips. Whether of horror or fury, he could not tell. In that instant, Keppel turned and fled along the ledge, his heart pounding, his mission transformed. The fragments were no longer his burden. They belonged now to the river, to chance, to history itself. Whether they would resurface in the thaw, whether some fisherman or child would stumble upon them, this was no longer in his control. His only task was survival. The constables gave chase, but the twilight, the treacherous footing, and Keppel's desperation gave him a narrow lead. He vanished into the forest once more, blood seeping from a gash in his hand, breath tearing his chest. Behind him, voices echoed in anger and prayer, mingled indistinguishably. From that confrontation, no official record survives, only Keppel's torn coat later recovered in a wayside hut, and the testimony of a shepherd who swore he saw a man stumble through the trees at dawn, eyes wild, as if carrying a burden no one else could see. The days following Keppel's final flight dissolved into shadows and rumor. No definitive record marks his passage after the confrontation at the ravine. Instead, fragments surface from disparate accounts, each tinged with fear or uncertainty. A shepherd claimed he saw him stumble through the snow, coat torn and eyes hollow, whispering to himself in a language he did not understand. A tavern keeper in a hamlet farther north insisted. A man matching his description begged briefly for water before vanishing again into the woods. And in a parish record, neatly entered in Latin, a single line appears, "The wanderer has been accounted for." No further explanation is given. The ledger fragments he carried into the mountains were gone, consumed by the river's icy current, yet their absence became a presence of its own. Whispers spread among the villagers that a fisherman had hauled in a sodden bundle, only to be visited that night by two sisters who relieved him of it. Others swore that in the spring thaw, children found waterlogged pages clinging to reeds downstream, but their parents quickly burned them for fear of reprisal. Truth and invention entwined, until it was impossible to know which fragments of the ledger had survived, if any at all. In Griesbach itself, St Aurelia wasted no time. Within weeks, masons were observed bricking up portions of the infirmary basement. Officials announced that renovations were underway to improve sanitation, though the rooms in question had never been public. The vestry passage that Keppel once uncovered was sealed with iron bolts, its door disguised beneath plaster. When curious townsfolk asked questions, the parish gave only bland assurances. "The doctor left us. His work was completed." The contrast here was stark. On the surface, a triumph of order, neat walls, and pious explanations. Beneath, a wound hastily sutured shut, leaking suspicion. Mercy was preached louder from the pulpit than ever before, even as grief festered quietly in households that still counted the vanished among their kin. Families whispered to one another, but fewer dared to speak openly. The example of Keppel had made the consequences of resistance plain. Artifacts from this period survive only in the margins. A blacksmith's ledger records, payment for reinforcement, A vestry door. Parish account. Letter from a nun at a neighboring convent mentions. Our sisters labor day and night to ensure silence is preserved, though some among them tremble. Most, chilling as a parish bulletin noting that a stranger has departed in peace, leaving no debt unpaid. The phrasing is benign, to the casual eye but unmistakable to those who remember. It was the same euphemism once used for the patients who vanished. Yet not everyone acquiesced. Frau Steiner, the widow who had once offered to hide the fragments, continued to press quietly. She told neighbors that the chamber had been real, that Keppel had not been mad. Some listened in secret, though many turned away, unwilling to inherit her defiance. Years later, her grandchildren would recall how she kept a single scrap of paper hidden inside her prayer book, a torn edge bearing only 3 lines of ink, blurred but legible. Receptum est in nocte, 87. Keppel himself became a phantom in the region's memory. To some, he was a fool who meddled where he should not have. To others, he was a martyr, silenced by forces too vast for one man to fight. His journals, scattered and incomplete, would not resurface until decades later, and even then, large portions were missing. What remained offered only glimpses, frantic sketches of the chamber, half-translated notes of the coded ledger, and repeated invocations of the same plea. Do not let them vanish. Institutionally, the matter was considered closed. Reports filed with Innsbruck declared Keppel absent without resolution, his findings unsubstantiated. The parish declared St Aurelia renewed, its mission untarnished. Services swelled, not diminished, as villagers clung tighter to the church in the wake of scandalous rumor. The very force that had raised suspicion seemed to consolidate power by suppressing it. The aftermath reveals the cruelest contrast of all. A man's struggle to illuminate silence ended not with revelation, but with deeper shadows. Proof was drowned in the river, testimonies scattered to the winds, while the institution endured, fortified by secrecy. Those who longed for justice saw only walls thickened, doors bolted, and a narrative rewritten. The patients' names slipped further from memory, replaced by euphemisms in neat parish Latin. And yet, in the secrecy of attics and the margins of prayer books, whispers survived. The story of Keppel and the chamber beneath St Aurelia did not die. Though it was buried, it waited, like the river beneath its ice, for a thaw that might one day release what had been hidden. Decades after Keppel's disappearance, the traces of his struggle lay buried in the most literal and figurative sense. Parish accounts from St Aurelia remained pristine, immaculate rows of births, baptisms, and burials recorded in a hand so uniform it seemed mechanical. There was no mention of the vanished patients, no space where they might have belonged. Instead, gaps appeared, stretches of months where no deaths were recorded. Despite the infirmary's constant intake, to the casual reader, the records conveyed health and stability. To the discerning eye, the silence screamed. In 1954, a state inspector named Lucas Schwann, tasked with modernizing health registries, stumbled upon these anomalies. Reviewing the parish archives, he noted inconsistencies between supply orders for medicine and the reported patient census. A requisition for 40 doses of laudanum might appear. In the same month, the records listed only 5 inpatients. When he asked the parish for clarification, he was told the infirmary had temporarily housed travelers who left without needing formal documentation. The explanation was so neat it rang false. Schwann dug deeper, requesting access to older ledgers from the early 20th century. The parish reluctantly complied, but many volumes bore signs of tampering. Pages had been cut out entirely, bindings restitched. Margins where annotations should have appeared were scrubbed with pumice, leaving faint scars on the parchment. A particularly telling artifact survives in Schwann's notes, a sketch he made of a half-erased entry dated 1909. Beside a patient's name, once written clearly, there remained only a ghost of a phrase, receptumist. The same words that had appeared in Keppel's salvaged scraps. The inspector filed a confidential memorandum to Vienna, warning that substantial irregularities suggest concealment of patient outcomes. Yet, just as in Keppel's day, the institutional machinery resisted. His report was quietly shelved. Within a year, Schwann was transferred to a remote district, his inquiries left unresolved. The motif of sealed archives extended beyond the parish. Municipal records revealed that property surrounding St Aurelia changed hands multiple times between 1925 and 1945, always under entities tied loosely to church holdings. Each transfer generated new inventories, yet none listed the infirmary's basement chambers. Blueprints submitted for official review depicted only the public wards, kitchens, and chapel. The stone cellars where Keppel had stood simply did not exist on paper. Here the contrast sharpened again. official documents brimming with order and clarity, yet truth relegated to rumor, to absences, to what was missing, rather than what was present. The archives, designed to preserve memory, had become tools to erase it. Still, faint leaks persisted. In 1972, a young seminarian in Griesbach confessed, privately to a fellow student, that while cataloging old vestry belongings, he discovered a locked cabinet containing unusual papers. These, he said, bore the names of patients, alongside numerical codes and Latin phrases he could not interpret. Before he could study them further, a superior confiscated the bundle, warning him never to speak of it again. Years later, the seminarian, by then disillusioned, and no longer in holy orders, recounted the incident in a letter that survives today. Other fragments surfaced in unexpected places. A crate of donated books in Innsbruck's diocesan library contained, tucked within a prayer manual, a slip of paper bearing a single line, in Nocte, 141. No explanation accompanied it, but archivists recognized the handwriting as consistent with early 20th century parish ledgers from Griesbach. The number, 141, matched the running total of vanished patients later tallied by outside researchers. Each discovery was like a pinprick of light against a vast canvas of darkness. They proved nothing conclusively, yet together they pointed toward a pattern that could not be denied. Keppel had been right. The records had existed. The vanishings had been noted, coded, hidden. The institution had worked not merely to suppress scandal, but to engineer an alternate history where absence itself was unremarkable. And so the archives became both prison and witness. They concealed with meticulous care, yet their very erasures testified to what had been lost. To read them closely was to hear silence speaking louder than words. By the late 20th century, St Aurelia still stood on its hill above Griesbach, its bell tower rising against the Alps, its reputation carefully burnished as a place of charity and faith. Tourists who passed through saw only whitewashed walls, tidy gardens, and sisters moving in silence across the cloister. Few knew that beneath those stones lay questions that had resisted burial for nearly a century. The infirmary basement was sealed, the parish ledgers scrubbed, and the official memory rendered spotless. Yet beneath that immaculate surface, an unease lingered like a stain that no lime wash could conceal. The case of the 214 patients, stretched across 14 years, remained unsolved not because evidence had never existed, but because evidence had been deliberately hidden, destroyed, or drowned. Here the contrast was final and cruel. The institution endured, whole and unbroken, while those it had silenced existed only in fragments, blurred ledger marks, burned notes, whispered testimonies. Faith had declared itself eternal. Human memory had proven fragile. And yet, as scholars, investigators, and local families pieced together scraps across decades, another truth became clear. Silence is never absolute. Whispers find cracks in walls. Rivers deliver what they swallow. And archives reveal as much in what they omit as in what they contain. Even in absence, the vanished patients spoke. Keppel, though erased in life, left echoes that reached beyond his own century. The ledger fragments, though scattered, forced questions that refused to die. In the closing passages of his journal, the last lines never sent to Vienna, Keppel had written, "If history will not record them, then we must become history ourselves." A reminder that to vanish without witness is the gravest cruelty. Those words, preserved against all odds, offer the most haunting epilogue. They remind us that institutions, however powerful, cannot fully erase the duty of remembrance. What remains, then, is a question not of St Aurelia's past, but of our present. What do we owe to the silenced, when their voices reach us only in fragments? Do we accept the official story, the sealed doors, the pristine ledgers, the homilies of mercy, or do we bear the discomfort of memory, naming the voids for what they are? Perhaps that is the final lesson of the 214, that memory itself is a moral act. To recall them, even without certainty, is to resist the machinery of forgetting. To ask where they went is to refuse complicity in their erasure. And so the story does not end with the convent's walls or the bricked chamber, but with us, the listeners, inheritors of questions that the sisters labored to bury. If you have followed this far, the story is now in your hands. What would you have done, standing where Keppel stood, clutching a satchel heavy with the voices of the lost? And what will you do now with the silence that remains?